Hello. Thanks so much for coming to our panel discussion of social media and what do I say? Civility and citizenship. I've done a lot of teaching on social media and civility, so forgive that. But we will be hearing about civility among other topics related to citizenship on social media. I'm Dr. Kara Kendall-Morwick. I'm in the English department here at Washburn, and I'm really pleased to be able to introduce our panelists and to moderate the conversation to follow. So I'll go in the order in which I think they're going to give their opening remarks, and then we'll hear a little bit from each panelist, and then we'll have lots of time for conversation and questions from the audience. Just before I get to that, I wanted to briefly remind people or give you a heads up about another fantastic WooMaster opportunity happening on campus next week. We're going to have Dr. Caritha Mitchell as a guest. She'll be delivering the annual Lincoln Lecture. That's going to take place on Thursday, February 27th at 7 p.m. and that will be in the Washburn Theater and is open to the public, so we hope to see many of you there. So to turn to our panelists for today, Maria Stover is professor of mass media here at Washburn. Originally from Bulgaria, her research focuses on the study of media systems in Eastern Europe, various aspects of the gender problematic, and most recently, the social impact of new communication technologies. She has published research in the Howard Journal of Communications and the International Journal of Communication, among others. One of her recent publications is an edited volume on women in politics and media, perspectives from nations in transition, from Bloomsbury. Dr. Ashley Mudeman, who received her PhD from the University of Texas at Austin, is an assistant professor in communication studies at the University of Kansas, as well as a faculty research associate with the Center for Media Engagement. Her research explores political media effects, specifically those related to digital news and political incivility. She studied how people select news stories to read in digital news and social media spaces, has examined incivility in the New York Times comment section, which I imagine is a rich source of data, and has investigated ways to encourage people to overcome partisan bias when interacting with digital news. In addition to her theoretical work, Dr. Mudeman has developed innovative research designs, including a new method for researchers to use when analyzing textual content in large data sets. Her work regularly appears in top academic publications in communication and media fields, and has been recognized with awards from divisions of the National Communication Association and the American Political Science Association. And finally, we'll have Dr. Joseph Kendall-Morwick. He's an assistant professor of computer science at Missouri Western State University. He grew up in Ohio and earned his PhD at Indiana University studying artificial intelligence. Since then, Joseph has worked for many small colleges, tech firms, and tech volunteer organizations across the Midwest. His research interests include the sociological impact of technology, particularly identity management, machine learning, and open source software. So join me in welcoming our panelists.
Good afternoon. I'm just going to stand up because it appears to be easier to switch slides this way. I chose to make it more visual because I'm never sure who is part of the audience. And I always think that it's easier to keep millennials' attention when there's something big and flashy. But it's also a quick way to provide some visual data. So the way I was kind of thinking of starting my remarks today was largely centered around my passion for the truth, right? And that's journalism's objectives, truly to serve the truth. And journalists are trained to do that. They're professionals in doing that. And that is something that enticed me into the profession of journalism and mass media. I was born in Bulgaria and lived during communist time. And it was really hard for me to live in a society where we all participated in one big lie. And I was trained to openly present lies. And we all knew that it was a lie, yet we openly consented to participating in this lie. So that made me very sensitive to knowing the truth and talking about the truth. So as soon as the Berlin Wall fell, I was just enamored by the profession of journalism. To me, that was the natural choice. I just showed up, in our kitchen. I clearly remember this, and I told my grandparents, I want to be a journalist. And that's it, and they never questioned that. I think they truly understood this. But that's what journalists do. And journalists, as a profession, thank you. A lot could be said about the importance of, journalism or free press, and these days free media for democracy, and journalists' role to be, keep government in check. When I was in journalism school, we were constantly exposed to the quote you see above by Thomas Jefferson that clearly indicates the importance of a free press, of a functioning press for democracy. And there's a lot of conversation still happening about that topic till today. But I think we agree that good decision making depends on really people having reliable, accurate facts put in a meaningful context. And in fact, that's part of what I'm trying to establish today, provide some context for our discussions and conversations. And it doesn't necessarily just relate to topic of politics, but it could relate to any type of important decision in life, whether to vaccinate your kids or not, or whether, we want to trust information on global warming, for example. So good decision making then might be probably a vital part of our conversation, at least that's what I was thinking. And of course we live in a new media ecosystem. There's so much written about it. Millennials and people born in the 90s and early 2000s, they have not experienced anything else. So there have been, the digital natives, yes, yet there has been a lot written about the naivete of the digital natives at the same time. And, one of the problems with what we're experiencing and what we'll probably talk about is the fact that this new digital system has also allowed for an enormous volume of data to be produced. This is an infographic from MIT Digital Lab, and it just gives us a quick visual representation of how much data is produced on a daily basis. And it's just something that each time I look at the actual data, I find it pretty, impressive. It always just, it's hard for me to imagine unless I really think about 5 million laptops. It's the equivalent of 5 million laptops. Or 90 years, for example, of HD video. But this is the environment we're currently living in, where we have so much information and so much content generated by users, and I think we will soon have the opportunity to hear about user-generated content and user identities as well, that we are starting to see more and more research and attention being paid to what captures our attention. There's just way too much happening. So the ability to actually capture information, attention, and maintain that attention becomes vital. And there's also conversations about, whether the average person is these days acting as a journalist. And that is probably something that we could be addressing as part of the, our conversation as well. But the core of this is, a concept that research has been examined and journalists have been talking about for a while now, centering around the idea of attention economy, right? where attention is truly a valued resource, and most of that valued content is the one that actually attracts attention, because we measure success even of media organizations or other platforms by page views. So what attracts then a page view? That is pretty much novel, sensational, emotional type of content. And unfortunately, mainstream media were forced to adapt to these techniques as well, which then leads us to some of the issues I'm going to raise next that relate to media being vulnerable to manipulation as well. But a lot of things have changed in the past 20 years, between decline of local news, less fact-checking by journalists, less investigative reporting, a lot of sensationalism, certainly reporting without context. And some observers actually talk about unfinished digital revolution, because we're experiencing as we speak today. So for 2016, the word of the year was post-truth, and this is the definition. But we have all of these events that I just kind of briefly touched upon as powerful drivers of this post-truth environment, if you wish. And some would say, well, this is not new, right? This has been happening for a while. From the outset, especially with daily newspapers, we have the Yellow Press. We also have Orson Welles with his Invasion of Mars radio broadcast. So these are just powerful reminders that some of these realities have existed for a while. Yet I believe that the communication revolution is marked by novel dynamics that are also producing novel effects. And I think that that's what a lot of the research and probably some of the things we'll talk about will concentrate on. So in this powerful dynamic, we have, political lying, we have bad manners, we have fake news, we have alternative facts, we have a president who openly criticizes media when he doesn't agree with the content of the reports, and calls mainstream media and mainstream reports fake news. All these challenge basic democratic norms and really undermine open and pluralistic communication among citizens, if I have to be asked about my opinion. So a little bit more data from Pew Center of Research. What I appreciate at this point of our conversation about these harsh realities is that more and more people are starting to think in a more nuanced and critical ways of fake news or misinformation or disinformation. The conversation is reaching a level where we hear more and more about it, and it's not just confined to narrow circles of academics, because for a while I believe that's where it existed. And when I first started talking about that in my classes, it was just like, what do you mean? And now students, millennials, younger people kind of are aware of this. They're even aware of the 5 types of misinformation, and they're listed in this graphic. But the reason why misinformation persists is because, well, it makes money, and we have very well documented reports at this point how made up information makes money. One that particularly resonated with me was from Macedonia, because Macedonia borders Bulgaria, and these young, very intelligent youth were generating, they were in charge of 140 websites generating, false information, and there was no partisan bias behind it. It was strictly a way for them to make money. They had no opportunities. extremely intelligent, unchallenged. They're like, well, we're just gonna figure out a different way to make money. But of course, we have digital technology, and probably we'll hear a little bit more about that, kind of facilitates the spread of misinformation. And of course, I think to me the most interesting aspect has been the public's lack and any effort, or rather very low interest, at least at the very beginning, about what was happening. So very quickly, to go through this, the misinformation and trust and polarization are interconnected. You could think of it as a vicious cycle where the truth is becoming more and more difficult to locate, and it really creates a lot of confusion and leaves readers doubting everything, including real news. But the more people are persuaded that traditional media are not delivering the truth, the more they turn to partisan or alternative sources of information, then that action in turn pretty much reinforces and validates their own belief, which is selective exposure and selective retention. And then there's been more and more talk about information tribalism, which in turn worsens polarization, of course. So just quickly, Americans are finally realizing that made-up news is a problem, and they see it as more important than a lot of other issues. And they're also recognizing that it has detrimental effects, that it has real consequences. And to me, this is actually significant progress, that we're finally having a debate about it, and we're trying to work on solutions towards it as well. I wish I had the solution. I wish we had a magic button that I can press and fix it. Clearly, that's not where we're at this point. There have been various solutions offered towards this problem, and it's a very complex problem indeed. But I really think that we should establish certain things. One of them is we cannot control the production of information. Simply, that's just not going to work. And no algorithm, for example, could or should attempt to police the volume of information. Second, we have to start understanding better how people consume information. It's been very interesting research. That is not my area, but I always find it very interesting to how people prioritize and consume information, for example, and how that can equip them with better ways of, fighting misinformation, and then in turn becoming more information literate. And then the American public agrees, and that was interestingly the type of research that arrived in my mailbox yesterday, that the solution to the problem are not necessarily journalists, but they want journalists to fix. They see journalists as the ones who should be fixing the problem. And I find this very interesting because that relates directly to my field. And the truth of the matter is that journalists have been working, and there have been some attempts, some more notable attempts as of last year, of how journalists can indeed fight that issue. But I think I'm going to stop at this point so that we could have the opportunity to expand the dialogue. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. I've actually never been on Washburn's campus, so this is lovely and a great excuse to be here and to be part of this conversation. I'm also going to be talking about the lovely, optimistic problem of incivility. So we started with misinformation and talking about incivility, but I want to talk both about some of the potential problems about engaging in civic engagement on social media and engaging in politics on social media, and how incivility plays a role in that, but then also talk about how there might be some opportunities and how it's not all bad either, although the bad stuff is pretty bad. And again, happy to answer any questions after we all give a bit of an introduction. So first of all, I just want to very briefly, when I say incivility, that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I won't go too much into it, although that's part of my research as well, so I'm happy to answer questions about it. But I'll say in the space of social media and digital communication, what people often mean when they're talking about incivility is use of profanity and obscenity and name calling and harassment, all the way up to using racist and sexist and homophobic slurs and that type of thing. Again, it's not the only kind of incivility, but in this space, that's often what's meant when we're talking about incivility. So a lot of what I'll be talking about is focused on that kind of language. And I'll also mention that people react to incivility in very different ways. It's not that everybody sees things that people might perceive as uncivil and then they're like, oh no, that's awful. Some people actually get more engaged in politics when they see people attacking each other, and other people kind of shut down. So again, what I'll be talking about are kind of overall trends, but I want to make sure it's clear that there are different reactions based on different people from different types of groups, and power dynamics are really important in things as well. So those are all important things to think about, but I'll also be kind of talking generally about some of the effects. So some of the downsides of this kind of language, I think there's not one good survey of how much incivility is on every different type of social media account, or in my case, a lot of the research I've done has been in comment sections of news spaces, which is a type of social space as well, even though it's not always necessarily Facebook. But the studies that have been done suggest that there's somewhere between 10 to 15% of comments on news section or on news organization sites or on some social media accounts too. So this is not, we remember more of it, but it's not quite as prevalent as what people might think. But that doesn't mean that it can't affect a lot of different things. So for instance, some of the negatives and some of the risks, when I say a risk of participating in the public sphere online, one of the risks is that if you put yourself out there, you can be getting some of these things thrown back at you. So an example of this just from yesterday or the day before, a political science professor who I'm connected with on Twitter wrote an op-ed for the New York Times or Washington Post, and I don't even remember exactly what the op-ed was about, but she was posting on Twitter some of the hate mail she was getting in response and some of the tweets she was getting in response to a relatively thought out, you can disagree with it, but like relatively thought out piece of scholarship, and she was showing all of these really terrible things. Very, there was like transphobia and things thrown at her, and she, like all of this stuff that had nothing to do with her. And so that's a risk, and it's a risk that's not shared equally. The people who get the worst of it tend to be women, people of color, women of color tend to get the worst of that, even though men who participate in this way also do get hate mail. It's not quite as sexually oriented, or there may not be rape threats and things in there. So participating gets harder if you are in public and that's the kind of response you're getting. So that's one of the really risky and negative sides of this type of language, and this does happen in social media spaces quite often. The other thing that's important or interesting to think about is the risk of not just to the person who's doing something, but also to a website that's posting information. So for instance, on news websites, if they might post a news story, and if the comments on that news story are uncivil, even if the story itself was a pretty balanced type of story, if the comments on that news story are uncivil, the people who read that story and see the comments tend to think more negatively about the news organization, and they also tend to think in more polarized ways about the article itself too. So there's not just the risk of the people who are getting this thrown at them feeling in negative ways and having that affect their mental health and things. There's also a risk to candidates, political candidates who have uncivil spaces, or to news sites that have uncivil spaces. So that's also something that people have to deal with in these areas. So those are just two of the negatives, but there are clearly others. But on the other side, what makes incivility tricky is that, again, like I kind of mentioned, sometimes incivility actually increases participation rates or increases engagement with political information. So one of the studies that I worked on was on, a colleague and I who works at the University of Texas, and we were doing this with the Center for Media Engagement, did a study where we were analyzing the content of comment sections of the New York Times. And we looked at the kinds of information that site visitors were recommending. So it's the New York Times like button essentially is a recommend. And we found that if a comment had uncivil words, so again, name calling and that kind of thing, and they had words that indicated partisanship in some way, so the president's name, because this data set was from about 2010 to 2013, so if Obama was mentioned or George W. Bush was mentioned or something, comments that have both of those things actually got the most engagement and got the most recommendations. So on one hand, we could think of that as a negative thing of like, oh no, why are people engaging with this? But on the other hand, not all communication about politics is nice and thoughtful and rational, and maybe it shouldn't be all the time either. So that it might not always be a bad thing for some amount of incivility if it gets people to engage with news content or political content, if they might not otherwise. So that's one thing to be thinking about. Another potential positive is that those were comments in a comment section, but I've also done some research looking at when digital news covers politicians behaving uncivilly toward each other, so like Congress people fighting with each other or yelling at people and that kind of thing. I have some preliminary evidence suggesting that people don't actually want to read that, and so it might not be as attention-getting as some news organizations think it is. I say preliminary because I think I need to do a lot more research, and we need to do a lot more research on it. But that's actually, I found that interesting, that people seem to think that it was not a good thing when news was covering it. They wanted to see more coverage of things, of politicians working together and trying to solve problems instead of looking like petty kids in a schoolyard fighting each other. So I thought that was interesting. And then one last thing I'll mention is that a recent study I've been working on with a colleague who is now at she's now a postdoc at Stanford. Her name's Emily Van Doon, and again, this is also funded by the Center for Media Engagement Research, but she and I were looking at a project where we were seeing what kinds of things affected people's perceptions that a comment section or social space for a news organization was uncivil, and we found that when people felt connected with the other people in a comment section, they thought that section was more civil. And this could kind of go two ways. On one hand, because we didn't know the direction of this relationship, but on one hand, it could be that when spaces are more civil, people feel more connected to the communities there. And so that's something that a social media platform can take away, or a comment section could take away, or a newsroom could take away, to say we need to make our space more civil so people feel more welcome here. But on the other hand, it could also mean that when people feel connected to each other, they're more okay when people push boundaries sometimes. And that's also not a terrible thing. I mean, the thing I think about there is playing like pickup basketball or pickup soccer. People trash talk each other all the time, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. There's a community there that they're building together. And so there's something about having a community space that might inoculate people against the worst types of incivility. It might make the space more civil, and when it's not, there's still norms that people follow, and they might feel the need to follow those norms to stay connected with their communities. So I think that's a really interesting place to go, is to figure out what is it that makes a community space online feel connected, rather than having people kind of feel disconnected and feeling like it's more okay to send these really terrible emails to people. And instead of thinking of that kind of space, how can we make people feel connected in a way that hopefully makes a space more welcoming to people of a lot of different backgrounds. So again, happy to talk more about any of this or other things as well, but I will pass the mic.
Thank you. So my background was mentioned is in artificial intelligence, but and it, I think when I first started with those kinds of studies, a lot of how people perceive artificial intelligence was different than it is now. Mostly people would think of the Terminator or something, but it was like kind of a joke in the back of people's mind about the impact that something like that would have. And as over the last decade or so, now AI is in the forefront of a lot of people's minds when they hear the word algorithm, kind of shudder, right? So in the same sense that engineers working on the atomic bomb, for instance, had to grapple with issues of ethics, right? When we're developing this technology, what are we unleashing? That sort of thing. The same thing kind of struck me as I was going through these studies, and at Missouri Western, we've been expanding more into cybersecurity and those sorts of areas, and I've been finding my niche within those studies, and I think really, with my background in AI and thinking about policy and identity management and that sort of thing, I found kind of a natural home. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the fabric underneath some of what we've been discussing and how the medium impacts some of these other issues. And so generally, when we're working to influence each other, we're engaging in citizenship. And how that influence flows from us downstream to those most immediately impacted, like our friends and family or colleagues, will have the greatest impact on them, but it moves past towards other people, right? So we've got tributaries going into streams towards hubs of influence, right? Where we get to politicians and celebrities or social media influencers and those types of people. And this kind of concept is really a cornerstone in a lot of how social media has developed over the last few decades. So going way back to the search engine wars and how Google essentially won that war. There's a couple Stanford graduate students that thought about how we do academic publishing, right? So a similar sort of phenomena where if you are a big name in academic publishing, it's because other people have cited your work, and perhaps some of those people who have been citing your work have also been cited by other big names, and so on and so forth. And we weave this sort of tapestry of influence, right? So they tapped into that when they developed the Google search engine. Instead of searching for pages on the internet that happen to have a lot of keywords that you're looking for, which was fairly common with how other search engines would work, Google looked at what pages with those keywords were linking to your site, right? So how many pages were linking into your site and lending their influence, right, towards those search results, or essentially, they looked at a link from one site to another, kind of the same way we look at a like button right now. So, and then beyond that, we do also work with this directly social aspect of it when we, hit the like button or rate someone from Airbnb or whatnot. That we'll use that data to also determine, how to make recommendations to users. And then beyond that, even when you're not explicitly making your endorsement, sometimes you're kind of making an endorsement you might not even be aware of. So, for instance, YouTube and many social media sites will work with collaborative filtering and other similar algorithms that will determine, for instance, take a look at your interests and someone else's interests and determine that you have a relationship with them in the sense that you have similar interests in something that person B that you're related to is interested in that you have not expressed an interest in, might be something worth recommending to you, right? So, of course, a lot of these things can be exploited. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, but really underlying all of these things is the concept of identity, right? Who is person A versus person B, and where's the line drawn between them? So, identity in most social media environments is drawn by fiat, right? So you are who you say you are because Facebook says you are who you say you are, right? So essentially, this is all kind of a walled garden approach, an environment that Facebook has quite a bit, or I'm picking on Facebook, but really any of these social media companies has quite a bit of control over. And essentially, when we see some of these influence campaigns that have been in the news recently forming, you could just get on there and say, I'm Joe America, you should all dislike each other and this sort of thing. We can quickly pick up on a lot of those fakes if we look and see, oh, this person has no friends, and this person is, clearly just an account someone made and stuck on there. But it gets more sophisticated when you start applying this idea of networking, right? So early on in the 2016 disinformation campaign, you would notice perhaps some divisive comments from an account and look at their friends, and they would have a collection of friends who are all friends with each other and saying nice things about each other, but this is all fake, right? So it was developed to mimic the sort of social network that we see naturally being developed on Facebook. So, a lot of people criticize some of these companies for allowing this sort of thing to happen, and really, I would say technologically, we have the tools to detect this sort of thing and do something about it. It's not really that hard to apply artificial intelligence in a way that can, discover some of these networks, because they have novel features that organic kinds of social connections do not. So the question is, why hasn't this been done more? Well, there are some worries. It was mentioned that, when we apply algorithms, we need to think about, how much good are we doing versus how much bad are we doing. But then there's also the question of what are the motivations of these companies. So, and when we're looking at a private approach to handling social media, the motivations are different than they would be from our own, social interactions, from making friends just in the normal human way that we all do, right? My interest is kind of thinking about identity in a broader perspective than just this fiat identity that a company like Facebook would offer, and considering how more open approaches could impact, perhaps in some ways negatively and in other ways positively, the sort of situation we all find ourselves right now because of this new technology that has provided a medium for this sort of experiment we've seen over the last, particularly the last decade. So I saw a comment earlier today, basically, if you that a lot of you might have heard, if you are not, and especially leverage Facebook in particular, if you're not paying for something, you are the product. And that's a critique of these free services we get online from for-profit companies that will, we see some of these problems manifest in. But a worry about that from people like me who advocate for open solutions and open source software and that sort of thing is that also sort of depresses interest in those kinds of solutions, because you don't necessarily pay for those either, but there's a different sort of model to that approach. And if you want an example of, and I'm not saying that there are no problems with this, but if you want an example to see how identity can be managed in a more decentralized way and not in a fiat sort of way, then you can look at things like Bitcoin, right? Where you decide this is a person and they have this money, but there is no single entity that deems that as so, right? So it interests me very much as we move forward and we see how other open technologies have had impacts on other industries or other kind of realms, then how does it translate into what we're looking at with citizenship online, in particular in social media? So that's my perspective on it, and we'll go ahead now and open it up to questions.
I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Ashley.
Ashley, you said uncivil comments end up damaging the brand, even if they're not aimed at the brand?
There have been a couple of studies that suggest that's the case.
Do you think that is planned by some of the people that do the uncivil comments?
That's a really good question. I mean, the studies that I've seen haven't looked into any of that at all. And at least those comments in those studies were not, they weren't questioning journalism or anything like that. So I think it's probably possible, because there are definitely these groups, like you were talking about, there are these groups that are malignant actors, and they're trying to do these things. But I think some of it is not necessarily the point, that people just, they see something and they have a desire to express their opinion about it, and they do, and maybe not in a way that we wish they would. So I think it could be a mix. I haven't seen any exact data, but it could be a mix of those things.
I think also, sure. With the disinformation campaigns too, they try to exploit existing fissures, right? So if this is something new that we're noticing, they might even be aware that that's another avenue of sowing mistrust and
yeah, well, and I can speak to that point too of the that if they do figure it out, there is a lot of distrust in news for both good reasons and not so good reasons that exists and I think just like trust in pretty much every other national institution, trust in news has been plummeting since the 70s and it's at a very low right now, although it does depend on partisanship. Democrats tend to trust news media broadly much more than Republicans do. But that would be a fissure that people could start exploiting if they haven't already. It is something that could happen.
My question was kind of along those lines. Are we getting more skeptical? Because I feel like it's like I don't believe that until I get facts that can confirm it or deny it. So as a species, are we kind of getting more skeptical?
I think there is probably an evidence that points in that direction, especially at this juncture where we are, as I said, the information tribalism is just a great kind of example of that, of what's happening. There's just so much data, and Pew has generated a lot of it, indicating how distrusting we are of each other, levels of trust. And interestingly, many years ago, my dissertation was about social capital and the erosion of social capital. And I was like, okay, that's it, we're done. And here it is, more and more research and links to, social media and all these new evidence to the erosion of social capital. And now it's moving actually on a global level. There is so much evidence in, eroding trust in media on a global level, not just within the United States. The World Economic Forum has a very interesting kind of information on that. And I think what it leads to is ultimately we're lacking common spaces, where we could exchange ideas and informations. We are in our own, there's just so many studies and even very stark visual representations. That's one thing that I was thinking I might add, where we exist in our own information bubbles or echo chambers or worlds, and at this point, we don't even want to live next to people who are not like us. So it has vast ramifications. They're not just in the political arena, but from what I've seen, the data I've seen, the research I've seen, it's just actually translates to all our existence.
And I think just adding to this and the idea of people being more skeptical, I've seen a couple of studies too that suggest that when people hear or read discussions about fake news or misinformation, that they do become more skeptical, but they're not actually any better at determining whether something is fake or not. So the skepticism might not be bad, but we need to figure out how to direct it in a way that actually helps us, because these disinformation campaigns, in part, are to make us not trust anything. So if we don't trust anything, then nothing's real, so we don't have to listen to anybody, and then people can kind of do whatever they want. And there might be some evidence that that actually does work. So we need to help, I don't have the answer, but I think we have enough evidence at this point to say it is we need people to be skeptical, but not so skeptical that they can't figure out what is real or not. And that, I think, is a place we need to figure out something, and relatively quickly would be pretty good.
Yeah, and I don't want to, when I talk about different media in which we can, in different ways we can control the media, I do think that, or the medium, I I'm not necessarily trying to sell anyone on one thing or another, but we do see about, the vast majority of how we interact online is through this kind of one mode, and we haven't seen a lot of other ways of approaching that. And I think this is fairly common knowledge. It's not something I'm an expert in, certainly both of you more so, but the fact that people don't really necessarily act the same way online as they do in person, and the value of working, what I've noticed, I think, in the past decade as people recognize this, right? Like, oh, on Facebook people are jerks, but in person it's a little different. But we have a conversation, I'll have a conversation perhaps that touches on, political issues or ethics or whatnot in my classroom. And at first, everyone's kind of afraid that it'll become an online chat room, right? That when it comes up, that everyone will start screaming whatever their perspective is at each other, but that I've really in practice had much more valuable, I think, respectful ways of working these issues out in person than we have seen online. And I think that's somewhat on us, that technical people, and not providing a medium that we can use to also have that kind of discussion online. But it's something that I do have hope for, that as we consider more ideas, can change.
I wonder if any of you are considering in your own work or know of scholars who are considering, I'm thinking about incivility and the upcoming election and just what's happening politically right now in general, whether or not rhetoric and spin and media is actually going to have an effect on who turns out and shows up at the poll when the election comes. So.
I can take a little stab. Mostly what I'm drawing from here is not necessarily my research, but research I've seen about political advertising, which may or may not totally translate to the social media space, because this is a little bit more all-encompassing. And the social media space has, I'll end with a positive social media trend with the social pressure. But actually, so political advertising, it seems like, there's been a ton of research on it. It's really hard to figure out exactly what the effects of the messaging is, just because there's so many other things happening in a campaign at the same time. But it seems like there's a small effect of advertising that actually increases turnout, even if it's negative. People hate negative ads, but the evidence seems to suggest that it actually does work a little, except in very, very narrow cases. Like there's maybe a tiny bit of evidence that if negative advertising comes at the very end of the campaign, and it's again, and there's the group of people who haven't quite made up their decision in the last 2 weeks, they're made up their minds, and they like one person a little bit, but they're not totally sure if they're voting for them, and they see a bunch of negative advertising. Those people might not vote at that point, but it's a very small group, but sometimes that can change an election. So I imagine that something like that might also be the case in digital ads, but I would not expect any kind of major, actually there's been all of this discussion of did all the Facebook ads change the 2016 election? And given what I've seen about advertising in general, my thought is probably not. Because ads just tend to reinforce what we already think. It doesn't manipulate us. If I were a Clinton supporter, I was not going to vote for Trump if I saw a bunch of online ads. So I think there are effects, and we need to be worried about them, and we need to study them, but they're probably not as big and scary as what it sounds like if you're listening to news coverage about them. I said I would end on a positive. There has been some research on get out the vote efforts. And so, for instance, Facebook did an experimental study with some academics a number of years ago at this point, where they put, and some of you might have seen this on Facebook, where they put something on the top of your news feed where it says, you can click a button that says, I voted, or I registered to vote. And then when you do that, you show up in other people's news feeds as saying, do you want to register? Here are all of your friends that registered. And that actually does seem to increase registration and possibly even voter turnout a little bit. So there are actually some aspects of the social space that can pressure people into doing things we might want them to. But then the messaging might sometimes have some negative effects. But I would say, at least in elections, most of these effects are very small because partisanship just drives so much of it, partisanship and habit of actual voting. And I talked a lot, so if anybody.
I guess I could,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, just to extend that also, when we talk about discouraging, turnout in different ways, if you look at some of the reports on, like some of the reports that just came out, I was reading up on, what's happening in the news right now, and there were, efforts towards depressing turnout in some groups by, kind of reducing their faith in the system or whatnot. But part of it also was just, raising the bar of effort that they would have to go through to vote at all, right? So by sowing misinformation, not just about like a candidate's, stated goals, but more just where do you vote, or like messing with registrations and that sort of thing, and trying to influence the result that way. So that's, I don't know anything about how successful that has been, but it is at least a concern that has been raised.
I was just wanting kind of to dovetail on this and just kind of, pose the question of whether we should be teaching civility.
I think that's a really interesting question. I'll come at it from a little bit different perspective, but I actually co-authored an article saying we should not try to get rid of incivility online. So I think maybe teaching, like, there are places where there are strategies where it can be helpful, but I do think that in certain types of incivility can be useful in certain settings, and that if I would never want to say incivility should be eradicated, in part because who gets to define it is often, again, if we're thinking Facebook and Twitter, they are the ones who pull things off. And I have not seen them do that in a way that that makes me want to trust them in the future. So just one example, they have their nudity, like you're not supposed to put nude pictures on Facebook, and it's one of the things that will get your images pulled down off of Facebook and Twitter pretty quickly. And the downside to that, even in that case where I don't totally disagree with like the pornographic side of it, but the downside to that is that a lot of women who were trying to post pictures of themselves breastfeeding were getting pulled off because it was technically showing, like it technically fit the definition of nudity and pornography. And I kind of think the same about incivility. I think that instead of trying to say like, that's uncivil, this is civil, like trying to figure out, and this is a much harder thing to do, to try to figure out how can you build those weak ties and strong ties, how can you build a community in which people have more leeway in how they act, but that they're acting in ways that keep that community in mind and keep the goodwill of the people around them in mind. I think that's much stronger. It's also just much harder too.
Squeeze in one more? Yeah, okay. Did that everyone?
I'll say a little more about that. So I think also when a major frustration for people on that front too is just the fact that it's so opaque, how that's handled. And I just really, not to beat a dead horse, but want to turn people onto the idea that that's not necessarily how it has to be. Under a different kind of model, users could have more say in how that sort of policing is done. You could come to sort of a community agreement about how, even if it's at an algorithmic level, right? An algorithm can still be in agreement among multiple people. For instance, some people might like a strict algorithm that would reduce breastfeeding pictures or whatnot, and for themselves, but that they don't need to enforce it on other people necessarily, right? Whereas when Facebook makes a decision, that's it for everybody, right? So.
I think I can speak loud enough, but doesn't that then turn around and isolate people and doesn't bring them together anymore.
Yeah, and I think this is, I'll let you both speak in a second, but I agree. And a danger with distributed social media is also that when you give, people, it's sort of the tyranny of the majority issue, right? If a lot of people decide something that would be immoral, then that's what's going to happen, right? So if there are ways in which you can have one entity like Facebook saying what the rules are and have problems with it. You can have problems from the ground up as well. So yeah, that can be an issue.
I just want to kind of add to the discussion of, what I was referring to at the end of, my presentation was saying that, you think that journalists can fix this. And, and one of the things that I see as an effort, and it's a rather novel effort, so I'm very interested in seeing more and more kind of experiments in that is, journalists always try to take report it to two sides of the story, and we've always known there isn't only two sides of the story, of course. The truth is, sometimes more complex, if you wish, without trying to really go into philosophical discussion of that. But with journalists, they're realizing that the very traditional way of reporting the story where there's just two sides, he said, she said, or this side, that side, is actually contributing to polarization. And they are experimenting with novel ways of engaging the audience, because that's the key. You want to still engage the audience without appearing to take sides. So there has been more effort in local news, in news hubs, creating these types of experimental ways of doing that as a way of addressing the crisis of mistrust and disinformation, and incivility too, I should say.
Well, that's our time. So again, big thanks to our presenters. And thanks to everyone for coming. We have some handouts with more information about other Woo Master events over on the table here, so feel free to grab some on your way out.